So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay, which is going to be including the newest faction in the game, at least at the moment. By the time this one comes out, who knows, maybe they've added another one with how quickly the Grey Elves suddenly appeared, but here they are, and they're going to be fighting alongside perhaps the closest they have in terms of kin in the roster in the Avari of Thor and Dwenath, and they're going to be facing off against one of the very few human-only factions in the game, two armies from the House of Halath here in the Haladin. It's going to be quite an interesting one this then. So who's your money going to be on? Some of the more lightly armoured elves in the Silmarillion roster, or the forces of men? Going to be quite interesting here. Both of these, or all three of these factions I should say, are actually going to be pretty good at kind of similar things, in that they're all going to be a little bit more focused on their lighter troops up towards their medium troops as well. In terrain like this as well, where there's quite a bit of tree cover, good opportunities for hiding and ambush, all of them are really going to be quite good at this sort of thing, so it's going to be interesting to see who comes out on top on this occasion. Yeah, this is also a map that we've seen a fair few times in Silmarillion at this point. I guess it's the one that they use for testing purposes quite a lot, but it's pretty good, so I don't mind seeing it a few times with lots of good terrain features, lots of good tree cover and that sort of thing. It should be really good for this kind of battle in particular. So, we shall go through the, well, what I would normally call the blue team, but it's not, it's kind of green and purple, like I've said in the past, kind of the Wimbledon colours for the team which you're viewing from the perspective on in Silmarillion. So that's going to be both of the Haladin armies. Starting off with Tundra's Fox, we're going to be seeing this battle from his perspective today, although it was actually, technically speaking, no one sent this to me, but Lord of Balagost was the one who pointed it out to me, and that I should pick it up from the replay channel in the Discord, so I have. We have the Rigswear of Grethel, so they're going to be one of the Haladin's many throwing projectile units. They also pull out a single side sword in melee as well. A lot of the Haladin units tend to be relentless, which means they can attack through being attacked themselves, they don't get staggered. I can't remember if the Rigswear are, to be honest with you, but it is one of the things that they can definitely use to their advantage against, especially factions like the Avari, who aren't going to have the best defensive values themselves. It means, regardless of what they do really and how they catch the Haladin, they're going to take damage in return. Rigswear are also going to be pretty good at trading javelin fire with the Avari, which is who Tundra's Fox is directly opposing. We also have the Ulfadin of Efilbrandir. So they are a Berserker unit. They've also got very high mass, so they can push through enemy lines. They kind of do it automatically, in a way that's not dissimilar to what Trolls do, only on a smaller scale, of course, because they don't have quite the same unit size or heft as an individual Troll would have. But still, they're going to engage with the enemy, and then they're going to automatically start pushing forward. They are relentless. They're going to do a lot of damage with their twin axes as well. Definitely a dangerous opponent for the Avari and the Grey Elves to be facing off in direct melee, but of course they're also very vulnerable to arrow fire and the like, which shouldn't be too surprising. That's fairly run-of-the-mill as far as the Berserker Weakness goes. We've got some dismounted Waldschreiter Dragoons. I'm going to butcher the Germanic pronunciation on a lot of these, I truly apologise. So, a very relatively small unit, but they're also, by Haladin standards, a pretty durable archer at the very least. They've got a shield, their armour is higher than most of what the entry-level Haladin units are going to be offering to you. They're a small unit though, and that is worth bearing in mind. To be fair, none of the factions on the field today, other than the Grey Elves, are going to be truly at home trading arrow fire like this, but it does help to have at least something you can do to skirmish at long range while you get some of your more important units into position. Then we have the Husquala of Thar Galleon, so a combination of an axe thrower unit and then kind of a medium infantry unit, I suppose. Certainly not an alien concept for a unit that we've seen in all of these various Lord of the Rings submods. And like I said, throwing projectiles are going to be one of the very key elements in this fight, especially between the Haladin and the Avari over on this side of the field. They're going to be very, very important. Whoever gains the upper hand in that fight will likely go on to win this side of the field. So the Husquala are going to be very important, and obviously, again, the Avari themselves are going to be fairly vulnerable to this kind of damage if the Haladin can deploy it appropriately. Just in behind, we have what does make up the Haladin's best front line in the Sword of Brothia of Thar Galleon, kind of a medium to heavy line infantry unit. Obviously, they don't have quite the same level of heft as a lot of the Noldor factions or stuff like Angband, but by Haladin standards they're certainly pretty heavily armoured, and also they are relentless, so they represent both the best defensive tool that Haladin can use to fight a more traditional line battle, but they also do it in their own particular style with their ability to continuously do damage regardless of the damage that they are taking. So it should be quite interesting. They should be pretty good against the Avari actually as well, honestly. They're the kind of unit which I can imagine doing pretty well against them, but we shall see. This is pretty much the ideal time to test that, isn't it? Just in behind we have some more Rigswear, so yeah, more Javelin support. Good thing about this army for the Haladin is that we can at least see all of them. Over here we have the Skuldmire of Haleth. Damn, my voice really isn't designed to say some of these words, is it? But yes, this is an armor-piercing axe thrower unit, so similar to the Husquala that we saw in front, only this is a smaller unit. Armor-piercing projectiles on them as well, so potentially very, very useful for taking on some of the more dangerous and more heavily armoured targets that both of the opposing factions have. Mostly I think this is going to come down to the tree units that the Avari have. The Skuldmire are going to be really, really good at dealing with stuff like the Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth, for example. We have some Mardraut of Malduin, so some mounted javelin men, another unit which can be really good at hunting down this particular kind of unit. Interesting to see what sort of cavalry options their opponents are going to have today. But yeah, again, pretty heavily armoured by Haladin standards as well, so not the easiest thing to get rid of from an opponent's perspective. More Ulfadin and another unit of Rigswear. So let's see, do we have any differences in Alexander 10Q's army? Well, he's got some Warder of Brethel, which are a very entry-level unit of spears, pretty much the cheapest unit of infantry that the Haladin can field. In many ways, just a basic unit of spears here in high numbers. Probably not going to do so great against some of the better units that we can see from the Grey Elves over on this side of the field, but they do offer you a numerous front line, and they do also offer you a bit of an anti-cavalry presence, should that be required. And when they're backed up by something with a little bit more killing power, like the Swerdebroth here, maybe as a traditional front line it can work out quite well. We have some more Skuldmire, Jesus, and then some Rigswear. More Rigswear back there, obviously, like I said, more throwing projectiles as we make our way through the trees. There's probably a few units that are hidden that we can't quite see. The Dowerwarder of Ethelbrandir, armor-piercing javelin unit, and probably overall the tankiest and most dangerous infantry unit that the Haladin have to offer. Obviously, it's not really, like, straight-up fights are not really how the Haladin go about their business generally. But the Dowerwarder are pretty much as good as it gets for the Haladin from that perspective, and they've got a couple of units of them. More dismounted Dragoons. They've also got some mounted Dragoons as well, so plenty of cavalry presence, ranged cavalry presence from the Haladin, as you might expect, both in terms of horse archers from Alexander 10Q and javelin cavalry from Tundra's Fox. It was Tundra's Fox, wasn't it? Yeah, I'm not going absolutely mad. And more Mardraut of Malduin as well, so lots of cavalry. Interesting. Now then, moving on to the Elves. What do they have in store? We've got Mevin, who's got plenty of sword bearers of Mithrim. So in this situation, I would suggest that the Grey Elves last time around, we saw them having to throw themselves against a well-prepared Gondolin defence, which very few factions in the game are going to thoroughly enjoy. On this occasion, I think we'll get a better look at what some of the rank-and-file Grey Elves can do against a foe like a Haladin. Should they be able to engage them in a straight-up fight like they may wish to? Obviously, the Haladin are going to want to try and delay that as much as possible, I think. The Sword Bearers of Mithrim, how well they stand up to stuff like the Swerdebroth is going to be fairly interesting. I imagine they're going to do quite well against stuff like the Warder of Brethel, but we shall see, won't we? Over here, meanwhile, we have a catapult manned by the Hewing Guildsman of Androth. Bringing a catapult's an interesting choice against a faction that can bring so many hidden units. If you intend to try and get them to advance towards you, it might be a bit of a fool's errand, but we shall see. And then the only other force from the Grey Elves that we can see, at any rate, a couple more units of sword bearers. The Hewing Guildsman of Androth should be really good if they can get into melee. We saw them perform pretty well, honestly, against Gondolin, so they should be just fine against the infantry that the Haladin have to offer. But yes, here they are, axemen as they are. We've got the Outlaws of Hithlum, which is kind of interesting, so they actually do have a human element to their faction as well. You can tell by the way they're holding their axe as well. They're a throwing axe unit combined with perhaps a two-handed spear, which not too dissimilar to the kind of thing that you would expect from stuff like the Stalkers of Thar Galleon, only with a throwing axe rather than a spear. Interesting to see some of the Hithlum helmets as well. Should be quite an interesting thing to see them engage with some of their distant cousins. More Hewing Guildsmen of Androth. This is the Outlaws of Hithlum are actually where the general is, which is quite intriguing. And the rest of the army will be scattered, probably hidden in and amongst those trees over there, I would imagine. And this force is just going to try and occupy the hill right in front of them. But that's all we can see from the Grey Elves for the time being. Yep, so this is going to be the Avari's army moving on. And we have Captain Gervais, he's got some shades of the Guarded Path. We saw them It's a pretty good effect in the late game of the most recent siege we saw on Silmarillion, and against the Haladin they should be very much at home if they get into melee, a very, very dangerous foe that the Haladin will want to deal with before they ever reach their lines. Lots of bow wards of the Darkling Woods, much in the same way as the Warder of Brethil. They represent sort of the basic spears for the Avari, and in the middle the Stone Hewers of the Darkling Woods. Every time we saw the Stone Hewers when the Avari were first released, in the couple of battles I showed of them, they were sent into situations where they weren't really ideal, but here against the Haladin they should be able to perform quite well if they can get into melee and start laying down that damage that they can deal with those one-handed axes. The Thorncasters, this is the way I think in which the Avari are going to try and dominate the throwing projectile fight against the Haladin. They're going to try and move forward and force the Haladin's hand somewhat, and the Thorncasters are significantly tankier than most of the throwing projectile units that the Haladin have to offer. So it's one way in which the Avari can make life very, very difficult for Haleth. We've got some Moss Stalkers of the Darkling Woods. They're a bigger unit than the dismounted Dragoons, but they're not really as designed for skirmishing directly, so it's going to be quite interesting to see who can win the archer fight over here, albeit not as important as you might think. Another unit of Shades, expensive to bring 2 units of them perhaps, but worthwhile when you know they're going to be a good match for your opposing infantry, such as in this situation. More bow wards here at the back as well, so plenty of these basic spears to pad out the numbers. Perhaps that's as a result of bringing 2 Shades. The main infantry line now has to be made up of a few more of the basic spears than you may have wanted, but that's again all we can see. Doubtless there's going to be more hidden units from both the Avari and the Grey Elves which will make their presence known as the battle goes on, but yeah, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So I am rather interested to see how many of these Grey Elven units are going to suddenly pop into existence, and also how they're going to be wrapping around into the Haladin positions over there, because doubtless they will be able to fairly easily conquer this high piece of terrain here. And we already saw from the last battle in which we saw the Grey Elves as well that their archers are pretty devastating at long range when they can get into position, which is a potential problem for the Haladin, but of course this is where all of the hidden mechanics for the House of Haleth can also come into play. But at some stage, of course, we will be seeing a lot of units reveal themselves. There with the Skuldmire, or if the Sword of Brothian, lots of these Warder of Brethil, but like I said, I wouldn't be fancying their chances against too many of the Elven units in melee. They're really just here for their numbers. It's going to be a bit of a... The opening of this battle, I would imagine, is going to be a rather careful affair from both factions, really, as they try to move forward. Or not, as the case may be. Over here you can see that some of the Husquala are moving into position. So Tundra's Fox's army is going to be far more visible to the Elves than the army of Alexander 10Q. We're seeing a great deal of Grey Elven activity, even in spite of the units that are now moving over here. Plenty of the Sword Bearers getting into position. I mean, they will now be visible, of course, to the Haladin as well, but nothing that would be too far out of the ordinary for them, I would imagine. I mean, they do have the Outlaws, but they don't have any other ranged units that are ready to take up position on the hill just yet by the looks of things. And that was a unit that just popped into view. So here we finally will get to see some of the Grey Elven cavalry as well, the Shore Riders of Mithrim, a unit of Javelin cavalry as well. So they're going to be trading javelins on horseback potentially with the Mardraut from the House of Haleth. Interesting interplay between those 2 units potentially. It's not often you see pretty much the entirety of the cavalry force on the field be ranged cavalry only. Possibly there may be some other units that are hidden that we simply are not seeing. For the time being, still, what have we got here? They were moving, I think, so I don't know whether they're still hidden or not, but these dismounted Dragoons, Waldstreiter, I just don't have the I don't have the ability to pronounce these names properly, do I? But I mean, the Thorncasters are visible, but surely 1 unit of archers isn't going to be enough. Another unit perhaps moving over here. The Thorncasters, yeah, trying to get a little bit too close and then go into hiding these dismounted Dragoons, and it's not going to work out too well for them because they have immediately been spotted, and the Thorncasters are going to be enough to fairly easily cut them down to size. And when you add in as well the Moss Stalkers with superior numbers, also the poison projectiles means the Dragoons are likely going to run for the hills a little bit faster. I'm not quite sure what the thinking was here, but another unit destroyed, maybe just throwing them under the bus to feign a little bit of weakness and try and convince the Avari to move forward. Whoever takes the initiative in this fight, after all, is almost certainly going to run into a minefield of hidden units. So maybe that's the idea. Maybe taking the initiative in this battle is actually not the desirable thing to do. Maybe more so for Mithrim. They're maybe a little bit less ambush focused than the Avari and the Haladin. Order of Brathel moving forward, getting into a defensive position there to prevent any sort of flanking move. Plenty of Husquala, but they need to get far closer if they're going to be using their projectiles, and they won't want to do that if the Thorncasters are going to shoot them on the approach. And the dismounted Dragoons making a nuisance of themselves, I suppose, but yeah, I mean, this is always going to be something which is a little bit of a concern when they just send a unit of infantry out to potentially deal with you. More ammunition being utilised. I mean, by the looks of things, they have at least inflicted some casualties on the Moss Stalkers, but still you'd have to say that the Avari have had the better of this, perhaps in the long run, unimportant engagement, but a good start nonetheless. There's still that other unit of Dragoons as well, which, I mean, to be fair, they're pretty far extended. If the Grey Elves came down here, they could actually get in the way of them, but they have just revealed themselves. And they are now going to possibly shoot into the Moss Stalkers. I mean, I suppose you may as well shoot into the Moss Stalkers, because you're not really going to do enough damage to make it worthwhile shooting the Thorncasters, even if at this range they are the more dangerous of the ranged threats. But the Moss Stalkers taking a couple of volleys before they themselves are going to get ready. Looks like a move forward from the Haladin as well. This is interesting. So an aggressive move here. We will be going down to half speed and making use of those mechanics in this battle. Of that I have no doubt. Alexander 10Q moving over here as well to potentially try and attack Hilny. Part of the issue here, we will actually go down to half speed now, so I can mention this now, is a lot of the Grey Elven support is way over there, and it will take them a little while to get across here, and even then there's going to be hidden cavalry in the way, so there is a good opportunity here for the Haladin to crash down upon the Avari army and also this smaller section of the Grey Elven force. So maybe being so spread out isn't going to work in the Elves' favour. We shall have to wait and see. Sword of Rothia also should be pretty good in these kind of matchups. Meanwhile, the Husquala are taking some volleys from the Thorncasters. They need to start laying down a little bit more damage if they are to be worthwhile here. I mean, this is a fairly savage beating that they're taking at the hands of the Avari. Mardrout of Malduin are going to be flanking around. You can see that the bow wards of the Darkling Woods taking some throwing axes, and they are also going to be engaged in melee. The Sword of Rothia will be pretty dominant in this kind of fight. The bow wards is a unit of basic elven spears and lightly armoured at that. They're not going to do the damage to the Sword of Rothia, and of course the Sword of Rothia in return are going to be able to lay down a bit of a beating. The Stonehewers will do slightly better. It'd be interesting to see who gets the better of this engagement. I would still probably back the Sword of Rothia if they aren't being backed, or they're not being attacked, I should say, by the Thorncasters. Stonehewers moving in, bow wards once again. So this is a good opportunity as well to see how strong this Haladin line infantry is. This is the best they have to offer for this kind of warfare, and they're being backed up by a lot of Husquala as well, so this is, in terms of more traditional battle tactics, this is really as strong as the Haladin gets. They'll be a little bit worried about the Shades of the Guarded Path, however. They are the kind of unit that will be of concern to pretty much anything the Haladin have to offer in melee. Thorned Ancients are also in here. They'll be pretty difficult to kill, but the Ulfadin of Ethelbrandir should be a pretty good remedy for that particular problem that the Haladin may end up facing. There is the small matter of what's going on here. The first refusers. So they are utilising their rather unique projectiles, you can see here, almost like Nafatoon-esque poison slings. Very, very strange kind of unit, but there they are, the Gloom Hunters of the Trackless Dark. That's a very edgy name, isn't it? But they also intercepted the Mardrout of Malduin as they tried to flank around. So this flanking move from the Javelin Cavalry of the Haladin has been ultimately unsuccessful. The Avari were waiting for them with the kind of units that will be good at dealing with them. Meanwhile, the Rigswear of Brethel moving backwards. Still a few Dragoons in here, but they have committed forwards at this point, so they don't really have the luxury of pulling back at this stage, the Haladin. If they do, then everything will be for naught. You can see that they're doing really rather well when they're going up against the very basic units of Avari on the front line. But I would still be concerned from a Haladin perspective about the slightly stronger units they have at their disposal. Stonehewers, maybe not quite able to get through the medium armour quickly enough of the Sword of Growth here, and they can't of course interrupt their attacks either, so they themselves, their light armour once again may be proving to be a bit of a problem. Thorncasters, I mean the Ulfadin are going to be a problem for the Avari as well, because their tankiest units in the tree class units are going to be pretty well dealt with by units of Berserkers like that. I mean the Shades of the Guarded Path should do a good amount of damage in return, but they seem to be a little bit isolated here. Husquala are doing their thing. Dismounted Dragoons getting into melee, and they're going to be pretty good at doing that. Rigswehr trying to offer a little bit of support with their javelins as well as the tree class units move forward. Meanwhile, having a look over here, the Warder of Brethel and the Sword of Brothir together trying to take down the Hewing Guildsmen of Androth. You can see the Hewing Guildsmen, they'll be really good against the Warder of Brethel. They should still, based on what we saw in the last battle as well, have what it takes to take out the Sword of Brothir, but they'll put up at least a significantly better fight and do damage in return as well. It's a fairly savage battle going on at the moment. Dowarwarder of Ethelbrandy are getting in behind enemy lines. Defeat is a distinct possibility, which is somewhat surprising. I feel as though they would probably have the better of the Sword Bearers of Mithrim as the battle goes along, trying to get in behind the Grey Elven lines here. The bane of the incomers. Again, we saw very briefly in the last battle their pretty unique projectiles. You can see they're sort of trailing through the air as they are. A very bizarre projectile indeed. It's sort of like a mix between split shots and Watcher fire. But potentially very, very devastating. Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, there's the Outlaws of Hithlin. The Shore Riders of Mithrim are on the way across as well, but there's plenty of units in reserve here to prevent this flanking move from the Grey Elves, which is necessary of course, but it's a balancing act here for the Haladin, because now that they're moving forward, they need to commit enough to be able to overwhelm this hill defence quickly. If they commit too much, of course, then they'll be flanked by the Grey Elves before they can actually achieve their goals, so the second unit of Dowarwarder is on the way, and that should be enough to really cause some significant problems to the side of this Grey Elven line. The Hewing Guildsmen now, because there's only a singular unit of them, there's too many Haladin for them to hold on their own, but there are reinforcements in close proximity, there's a catapult as well, so for now I think the Grey Elves will be quite happy with how things are going there. It's a much more all-in kind of battle between the other Haladin army and the Avari down on the flat, however. The Thorned Ancients are still doing their thing. They'll be a bit happier in melee against the Rigswehr than they would have been against the Ulfadin. But they're still Ulfadin in close proximity anyway, so not all that really matters. The Dragoons are also in melee, decent enough as they are at such things. The Thorncasters, of course, make a decent tar pit in melee once they've used up all of their projectiles. The Sword of Brothir are actually struggling a little bit because they've already taken a bit of a beating at the hands of the Avari infantry, especially when you consider the Shades are here, in behind enemy lines as well. I mean, the Skuldmire are there. Very, very devastating kind of projectiles they've got. No Grandfather of the Deepwood Hearth by the looks of things though, so no obvious target for them to go after. They'll need to find better hunting grounds. Thorncasters moving in, but over here the Haladin continue to be fairly dominant on this part of the line. Husquala are in a pretty good position up here on the raised terrain, and they are continually battering the Avari in behind with their throwing projectiles. The Avari trying to respond in kind with some poison projectiles. There are the Rigswehr, the first refusers moving back around, having already blocked the flanking move from the Haladin, and indeed the Haladin now are getting flanked themselves, the Gloom Hunters finishing off this very depleted unit of dismounted Dragoons. And that will allow them to maybe go after something else, albeit the only other thing here is the Ulfadin, who will be able to put up a pretty decent fight in melee, as you would expect. Still, the Sword of Brothir are doing a pretty good job, as you would expect. The Thorncasters aren't going to do much damage in melee, neither are the Bowel Wards. And those swords will continue to rain blows down upon the Avari. a reinforcing unit of bow ward, so the reserves being committed forward for the Avari to try and keep the line strong. I mean, this is the kind of battle in which neither of these two factions are really heavily focused, a rather long engagement, but both of them will have been doing damage to the other with their throwing projectiles and their arrows. So how has that developed as the battle's gone on? Husquala being committed to the front line as well. Both sides continually throwing in their units. The shore riders of Mithrim coming around over here now to offer some support to their allies, so some mounted javelins. They can quickly find the areas on the field where they need to be and do good damage, and they have dealt with another unit of Husquala that were in behind. There's still the Skullfire, however, which would probably be a better target if they could get just a little bit closer than an already heavily depleted unit of regular throwing axes. How the Thorned Ancient's getting on? Probably not all that well. These dismounted Dragoons have taken a bit of a beating in melee. The Ulfadin are starting to take a lot of damage as well, as you would expect from a Berserker class unit. They don't have the most longevity once they're actually committed, and that will certainly not be the case if they take cavalry charges such as this, but I mean the Thorned Ancients seem to have weathered this storm pretty well also. Let's have a little look at what's going on here. The bane of the incomers being interrupted now as the Haladin swords and spears start to engage with them as well. The Hewing Guildsmen of Androth, they're doing a lot of damage, and certainly pound for pound they've gotten a lot of kills, but again as a singular unit there's only so much they're going to be able to do, and also stuff like the Dowerwarder is going to be able to put up a better fight, albeit like the Dowerwarder themselves, like not having the impact that you would have wanted them to have as from the Haladin perspective. With another unit of Hewing Guildsmen and another unit of Sword Bearers, the numbers and the superior position appears to be enough to stop really the best of what the Haladin have to offer as far as a melee unit goes. Outside of the damage dealing potential of the Ulfadin, perhaps. Mardrout of Malduin, they're trying to draw the Grey Elves in perhaps, so that they can use their Mardrout and their mounted Dragoons to start shooting into those units that are acting as the flanking force. More of the Warder of Brethil, the Skuldmire. The dismounted Dragoons are going to try and do some damage to the units that are up top. That was actually nowhere near as painful as it could have been. Centre mass into those Warder of Brethil would have been really, really devastating. Shore Riders of Mithrim going to get a somewhat decent rear charge into the Dowerwarder. It may cost them because they may end up trapped by the Warder of Brethil, but if you can take away the bits of quality that the Haladin have in this kind of melee fight, then the Grey Elves will be feeling very, very confident about this battle moving forwards. And with another unit of Sword Bearers as well, it looks as though the Haladin effort to try and take this hilltop position is going to end in failure. So they're going to need to hope, the Haladin, that they can defeat the Avari on the other side, because I don't think it's going to work out for Alexander 10Q here. He's still got his cavalry to play with, but ultimately he's lost a fair amount of his melee punch. His Dowerwarder are probably going to end up dead, his Swear de Brothia are almost completely gone, so his solid core has abandoned him. He has nothing but Warder of Brethil left to try and hold the line with. Meanwhile, the Rigswear doing their best on their own, but they're still fighting the remnants of a unit of Shades of the Guarded Path and plenty of Thorncasters in melee. Soon they'll have more skulls to decorate their top branches with. Meanwhile, more Husquala are being committed forward with to back up what remains of the Swear de Brothia. Not many of the Stone Hewers left alive, so you can see that the first wave that was fighting on this front line is almost completely spent at this point, and now it's down to who's got the best backups. Rangers of the Hidden Path are a dangerous unit, and the Skuldmire see them, immediately trying to deal with them as best they are able. Thorncastle's still on this front line. For the most part, the Haladin would appear to be gaining a slow but sure victory. Shades of the Guarded Path perhaps being overwhelmed through sheer numbers, because I can't imagine the Husquala would beat them under normal circumstances, and in fact I do believe that the Shades will be able to turn this particular fight around. Whatever happened to the Gloom Hunters? They're being kept in check by the Mardrout that they previously forced back on the defensive, so how the tables turn. Still that unit of Ulferdin, which is in reserve as well, that Tundra's Fox could commit at any moment, which he probably will need to be honest with you, just to help finish off this pesky unit of Moss Stalkers, which is going to, as it stands, overwhelm this heavily depleted unit of Rigswear. What do we have here? The Grey Elves actually electing not, by the looks of things, to flank around, which is interesting. Whatever happened to the cavalry? Am I just blind? Dragoons? Mardrout of Malduin? Ah, here we are. The Mardrout of Malduin, instead of attacking into the flanking force, they decided to come up here and start throwing their javelins in. I mean, better late than never, I suppose. Attacking the bane of the incomers. The Outlaws of Hithlum. Probably not going to be the best at taking arrow fire such as this, but I don't think the Grey Elves will mind too much. Mardrout of Malduin need to be very, very careful. They may have played themselves somewhat here, because I think between them and the Shore Riders, it's kind of a very similar kind of unit. Maybe the Mardrout have got a slight edge in terms of their armour, but when you consider the amount of infantry which is in support of the cavalry here, there's no way that the Haladin Riders are going to have a particularly good time here, and I think the gains they would have made by throwing those javelins at the top of the hill are not going to be enough to make up for the fact they're going to lose an awful lot of cavalry here. And so far, you'd have to say over on this side of the battlefield, the Grey Elves have done really rather well against the House of Haleth. Shore Riders of Mithrim pulling out their axes. They're gonna rout, aren't they? I mean, they managed to save one unit, but the other one is almost certainly going to end up routing. Another unit of sword bearers, blocking off yet another potential exit for the Mardrout. Oof, brutal. And they are going to be getting out of here. Another unit of Shore Riders and using their Javelin Cavalry to pretty good effect here of the Grey Elves, and still this Haladin army continues to struggle a little bit. Another unit of Sweardebroth here is still alive, however. In combination with more Warder of Brathel, the Hewing Guildsmen of Androth continue to be a problem for them, however. They've once again shown how effective they can be. Dismounted Dragoons. There's another unit of Hewing Guildsmen that are way in behind enemy lines here, but there's not really much, I think, that the Haladin can do to stop them at this point. I really like the capes on the Skullpile with the faction logo. And I'm sure they're decent enough in melee, and the Dragoons we already know to be fairly decent, but they're gonna... that's not really what the Haladin needs, so... What is the Avari's fate? It does look as though, to be fair, the Haladin are winning over here, continuing to win over here. The numbers that they have, too much, perhaps, for the Avari. Ranges of the Hidden Path engaging in melee as well, but there would appear to be too many Husquala for them to fight through. Still more bow wards, but they're just not going to be able to deal the kind of damage necessary. Still 53 Sweardebroth here, which at this stage in proceedings are still the Ulferdin somewhere over here. Yeah, and they have been committed forward now to rip those Moss Stalkers limb from limb. So yeah, I think the Haladin are going to win over here against the Avari, but they are going to lose against the Grey Elves, which is going to lead to a reckoning in the late game. Bow Ward's starting to rout. They still have their Skullmire, but I think they've used up all their ammunition, so they're going to get into melee. Plug this one gap that has appeared in their line. Fortunately for them, it's only really the Bow Wards that are there to offer any sort of resistance. Rangers of the Hidden Path probably okay in melee. But also not the sort of thing which is going to make the difference I'm sure they would hope for. And the one gap that was there is no longer. What have we got over here? The remaining Ulferdin, who in the end did manage to bring down the Thorned Ancients, are going to go after these remaining Rangers of the Hidden Path. 12 against 5. Considering how much damage the Ulferdin have already taken, I'd be surprised actually if they were able to beat the Rangers of the Hidden Path now. The Rangers can look after themselves just fine in melee. Maybe just fine isn't enough though, we'll have to wait and see. Here though you can see the wayward projectiles of the bane of the incomers. I mean, if your own units are over there, it could end up doing just as much damage to yourself as the enemy, but look at how widespread their projectiles are. It's a very unique kind of unit, isn't it? But yeah, you can see the Grey Elves pushing in from the flank, It's a rather ominous looking sight, isn't it? I mean, they still have their cavalry, let's not forget. Yeah, here they are, the mounted Dragoons. From Alexander Tenq's perspective, what you might want to do is keep them safe, so that you can then directly support your ally later on. Just try and do as much damage to the Grey Elven advance now as you are able. With your mounted javelins, your dismounted Dragoons, form up some kind of front line with the light infantry you have remaining to you, and just do the damage that you can, whittle the Grey Elves down so that hopefully your ally and your horse archers later on can push you over the edge for victory. Sword Bearers of Mithrim. I think actually it's about time we went up to ×1 speed, isn't it really? Skullmire moving backwards, the colourful capes of the Mardrout also in retreat, the Warder of Brethil, the remains of the Sword of Brothir doing their best to try and hold on, but yeah, this one unit of Warder of Brethil is going to be swallowed whole by the looks of things. The Sword of Brothir at least making it so that the Sword Bearers don't do that immediately, buying the Haladin a little bit more time, but yeah, dismounted Dragoons as well, more Shore Riders, something else which Mevin has done very well with Mithrim in this battle is utilise his Javelin Cavalry. Mardrout of Malduin over here as well. I mean, there's actually not too much left of the Grey Elven resistance up here on the field. The Catapult crew scurrying forwards, Rigswear of Brethil using their Javelins. To be fair, I mean, they have, technically speaking, overcome the resistance at the top of the hill here, the Haladin, but it's come when the side of their army is also being engaged with, so you know what, there's still so much going on. I think we do still need to go down to half speed. The Mardrows of Malduin charging into the Outlaws of Hithlum. That's dangerous because they're a two-handed spear unit, but they're also very depleted. More Warder of Brethil. I mean, it's pretty chaotic over here at this point. There's Grey Elven cavalry in behind enemy lines. There's javelin and arrow fire going back and forth, but not really in any sort of uniform fashion. The Warder of Brethil are going to get charged in the back by the Shore Riders, and that is enough to break them, which will of course allow the Tunnel Runners and the Swordsmen of Mithrim to advance forward and continue to overtake this Haladin territory. Meanwhile, what have we here? Husquala, Ulfedin, the First Refusers running for the hills, perhaps trying to squirrel some sort of support away for their ally, the Avari, knowing that all of these units are going to be making their way over to try and put up some resistance to the Grey Elven advance. Well, Rigswear of Brethil facing off against the Bane of the Incomers with their cobalt blue axes. Very lurid colours. Meanwhile, Mardrout claiming the high ground, the catapult now no longer a problem. Good opportunities for the Mardrout to start charging into some of these more isolated Grey Elven units, and they will need to be quick with that because you can see all of the Grey Elven units in the background moving forwards, including their own cavalry, so there's no doubt that all of these Rigswear units will be run over pretty soon by infantry and horsemen alike. The most uniform of charges, but perhaps it doesn't need to be against lighter, more auxiliary troops like this. Forward come the Sword Bearers, destroying that one unit of Sword of Brothir that remains. There's a few Warder of Brethil that also remain, but they won't last too long, like I said. Basic spears. And just in behind you can see the Dragoons getting into position now, ready to fire away. Another unit of Bane of the Incomers. Again, considering how chaotic this is and considering how their own units are over here as well, I'm not certain that the Bane of the Incomers is exactly what you want in this situation. The Dragoons charging into them as well. I mean, they are a very dangerous unit, so you do want to get rid of them if at all possible. Alexander Tenq making good use of his cavalry here.
Only half the enemy force remains.
Dragoons reasonably solid to this sort of thing, and you can see the Bane of the Incomers taking huge damage there from a pincer charge from 2 units of cavalry. Horse archers will know a unit of fairly squishy archers is never going to do too well there. The Avari general falls. In the end, the First Refusers not able to escape from their fate. The Ulfedin are pretty far away though, and they are one of the more dangerous units that the Haladin still have left, and I don't know, I mean the Grey Elves are still swamping over this position. And Haladin don't look to have too much in the way of organisation left to them, but they still have some good individual units, and there are still some isolated areas of the Grey Elven army as well, which the Haladin are doing a pretty good job here of picking off. The Avari still have some sort of presence on the field. Moss Stalkers being dealt with by yet more of the Swear Brothia. There's also still some Rangers of the Hidden Path doing their thing. 7 high-tier Javelin men. Still might be a real difference maker in this kind of fight, however. Bane of the Incomers still there. Need to get those mounted Dragoons back, really. The Shore Riders of Mithrim proving to be a real pain for more of this infantry. The Sword Bearers of Mithrim have been the backbone of the Grey Elven push, really. They and the Hewing Guildsmen, both units of Grey Elven line infantry, have been pretty good in most of their engagements against the Haladin. But, as I said, in this kind of battle, considering the factions involved, the winner will almost certainly be the one who can use their supporting units the best. And I'm not really sure who I would say has done that at this point in the battle overall. It's still very chaotic, still very close. In come the Dragoons. Still so much of the Grey Elven infantry though that I'm not sure. I think they're going to have to really use these mounted Dragoons very, very well to start peeling away at some of this manpower. They still have some Mardrout up here with Skullmire, so they will once again claim ownership over the hill after the Avari took it once again. But what the Grey Elves need to do, I think, is just form up an organised little force at this point. The more spread out they are like this, the more likely it is that the humans are going to be able to utilise their fast-moving units, their cavalry, to the best effect. They don't actually have that much in the way of anti-cavalry left either. Most of what they have left is a large amount of these sword bearers. I don't believe the tunnel runners are anti-cavalry. They've got much more of an anti-infantry kind of look to them, which will be pretty good, I think, against, considering the numbers they're in at dealing with what's left of the Ulfadin, which are on their way over. Meanwhile, speaking of Ulfadin, here they are. There's only 19 of them left, mind you. I think they've been taking charges from the Shore Riders, so again, good play from the Grey Elves utilising their cavalry. How dangerous those Berserkers can be. I mean, they're also taking charges from their isolated unit of Sword Bearers, so it's not a victory they've got for free by any means, and it's not a complete victory either, because there's still some of them left alive, but they've identified one of the key targets to try and take down, and they're busting a gut to try and do that. Larger out of there. Rigswear still have some ammunition, but they're very depleted. There goes one of the Haladin generals in this gold mine. Dragoons are still here, trying to do their thing. I don't think they've got the amount of cavalry necessary to really do the hefty damage off the charge like they would want. I guess they still have a depleted unit of Outlaws of Hithlum in amongst things as well, but 7 of them doesn't really count as having a significant anti-cavalry force in my book. In come the Ulfadin. Yeah, they are just going to... I mean, it's possible, I suppose, that by cycle charging they could end up winning this because of the lack of anti-cavalry the Grey Elves have left, but there's a few javelins coming in. Every time they charge in, they're going to lose a few more riders, and it's just whether or not they can keep the mass for their cavalry charges high enough so that they can continue to do damage. And also there's the fact that, I mean, they're scattering a little bit here though, the Grey Elves, which is dangerous to do. Yes, it means they're not going to have a single chunky target to be able to transfer all of that charge energy into, but it also means that anything that you do get charged is going to crumble under the pressure of it. So, in come the Mardrout once again, relieving the pressure on this very depleted unit of Ulfadin. More sword bearers fall beneath the hooves of the Haladin. Tunnel runners of Mithrim. These Mardrout are really putting in a real shift here in the late game, trying to do as much damage as they can. these Elven swordsmen. I mean, we're in the final stages. You'd have to say, based on numbers alone, surely the Grey Elves are going to have enough to deal with what the Haladin have left, considering most of them are horseback units. The Outlaws of Hithlum, even though there's only 5 of them left, if they can skewer any of these Dragoons, really, it would be very, very welcome. Still 63 tunnel runners. Not the sort of unit you want to see in melee either, but they've managed to isolate this one unit of swordbearers now, and they've routed as well. The Ulfadin are still there, 6 of them. A combination of the Marge rout and the Dragoons managing to peel away a fairly substantial unit of swordbearers there. And I think, you know, not forming up a cohesive defensive perimeter here and charging around the place like Grey Elves are doing is offering a potential relief here for the Haladin. A way back into this. Both units of Dragoons charging in. The Marge rout also doing a lot of damage here to the tunnel runners, and they are a light infantry unit at the end of the day. They could end up routing here under the weight of these cavalry charges, and a lot of them are. The Haladin general, though, is not going to be enough to convince the Haladin cavalry units to run away. I don't think it is. I think they're going to rout the tunnel runners here. I think this is the last unit that the Grey Elves have that isn't routing, and Shock and Awe is actually going to win this battle for the Haladin by the looks of things. The morale of the Grey Elves is collapsing under the weight of the cavalry charges. You can see that the percentage of allies killed is actually higher than the percentage of enemies killed, but most of those units at this point are routing. And the Haladin are going to win with only their horse riders remaining. Their Marge rout and their Dragoons, and there you go. Having no anti-cavalry in the late game proved to be absolutely crippling for the Elves. The Elves, who were pretty much on top until, well, the Avari were lost, obviously, to the Haladin over on the other side, but the Grey Elves scored a good victory throughout the first 3/4, really, of the fight, and then in the late game, when it was them with still a pretty decent amount of their infantry left against 2 battered and bruised Haladin armies, it was the cavalry in the end that proved to be pretty crippling, which is surprising as well, considering how well the Grey Elven cavalry was used as too. So, again, very, very closely fought, and in the end, morale was the issue, and the cavalry charges were very well placed. So Dragoons could have routed going up the hill on that side, and if that happened, obviously the Grey Elves would have won, but they didn't. They held on, they charged, broke the sword bearers, broke a unit of tunnel runners, and then the final unit of tunnel runners. Obviously, when you're isolated with a single infantry unit against even depleted cavalry like that, you know what your fate's going to be. They're going to charge you from 3 directions and you're going to break, which is ultimately what ended up happening. So, very well played to the Haladin there. They managed to use their resources in the late game to devastating effect, really. They turned the battle around right at the end there, and well deserved, I think. The Elves will feel maybe slightly aggrieved. I don't think the Avari can feel too aggrieved. I think in this particular battle, it's the kind of war theatre that neither of the 2 factions is going to particularly enjoy, being that long line battle that the Avari and the Haladin were engaged in over on that side, but the Haladin were better prepared for that kind of engagement, I think. The initial skirmish went the way of the Avari because they invested slightly more in it, but the Haladin had more of their core units like that. The Sword of Brothia really showed what they're all about on that side, and also the Ulfadin were going to be obviously very good at dealing damage, and I guess in many ways the Haladin are slightly better equipped for that kind of warfare than the Avari are, and it also wasn't the kind of terrain where the Avari were able to utilise some of their javelins and the like. They managed to stop a flanking move from the cavalry, which is perhaps one of the areas where we saw the Avari working as they're intended to, but the rest of the time the Avari were on a slow road to defeat, really, against the Haladin over there. While over here, the Grey Elves, maybe they could have been slightly more decisive with their flanking infantry force, and that would have forced Alexander Tenque's hand a little bit earlier with their cavalry. But again, that's splitting hairs, really, because you can never really be sure what way the battle's going to go if you do that, because if you charge forward there, your flanking force could end up getting picked apart by the 2 units of javelin cavalry and the horse archers, and then all of a sudden your position on the hill earlier in the battle becomes a little bit more suspect, and maybe then the Haladin would have won the battle in a different way. But they needed to do something different here. Clearly the Elven forces, maybe a little bit of a difference in composition, a bit more anti-cavalry perhaps was necessary. But irregardless of that, a very good battle indeed. Let's see what did the damage for the 2 Haladin armies. Casualties inflicted, 132 on the Doubtwarder. I mean, we saw them in a pretty tough situation, to be honest with you. It looked like they were being forced onto the back foot most of the time they were engaged. I mean, it is the best that the Haladin had to offer in melee, that, at least in terms of a defensive perspective, whereas Tundra's Fox went with the Ulfadin, Alexander went with a little bit more of the more defensive option in the Dawawada. They did okay, just based on the kills they got, so you can't really complain too much. The mounted Dragoons, meanwhile, were clearly the saviours for Alexander's army, because they were the main cause of the late game resurgence. Over 200 kills on each of them, most of those actually probably based on cavalry charges more so than the actual damage coming from their bows, which is interesting from a horse archer unit, but still, if it works, then it works. The Mardrout also, of course, performing valuable services there. Less kills, actually, interestingly enough, in spite of the fact they can do more burst damage with their javelins. Swerdabrothia also doing very, very well. As for Tundra's Fox, yeah, the Swerdabrothia doing excellently against the Avari frontline, as you would expect. You know, most of them getting over 100 kills, one unit getting 226, which is very good. Even if that's only against stuff like Bow Wards of the Darkling Woods, that's still a high enough number to the point where the Avari are always going to struggle if you're doing that kind of damage to them. Skullmire also doing quite well also, with their projectiles and in melee. Husquala, yeah, in many ways the more traditional warfare branch of the Haladin army, with the Swerdabrothia and the Husquala forming up that front line of infantry with throwing projectiles and then auxiliary infantry in behind. It was something that the Avari weren't able to really answer in the way they would have hoped. Mounted Mardrout of Malduin also doing quite well, at least one of the units, again, another example of the Haladin cavalry being the reason why the humans won this fight rather than the Elves. So a very interesting battle, that, and I'm glad that Lord of Belagos pointed it out to me, because it's a good example, really, perhaps the best example we've seen so far of the multifaceted nature of the Haladin, who've been in the game for a little while at this point, but we got to see them. They're not really designed for that traditional line battle kind of warfare, as I've said several times, but we saw how they can engage in such things, maybe not in the same way as a faction like Feanor or Fingolfin can do it. They're much more reliant on having that support in behind, but when it's there, they are actually able to compete in that kind of arena better perhaps than the other guerrilla-focused factions in the game, such as the Avari or Assyriand would be another good example of that. The Grey Elves, of course, a little bit different. They struggled a little bit more against the Grey Elves because they've got the ability to do a lot of damage with their own axemen and their own swordsmen. Good example of showing what the Grey Elves can do as well with their basic infantry. They are going to be a step above the factions like the Haladin, Assyria and Avari. They're going to be more able to engage in those kind of infantry warfare slogs and win. However, we also perhaps saw a potential gap in the roster that you can fall into. You know, the lack of anti-cavalry that was brought by Mevin here obviously proved to be absolutely critical. The Outlaws of Hithlum were long dead by the time, at least dead enough to the point where they weren't able to answer that cavalry. But yeah, we've seen the Grey Elves twice now in quick succession. The faction that I didn't even know was in development, and it came out very, very quickly, but here they are. Yet another faction that Silmarillion has. We're still waiting, of course, on the Naugrim, or the Dwarves, which will be around at some point, I am sure. That's the only other faction I can think of that's being added to Silmarillion. There may be another one, though. Like I said, I was completely unaware of the Grey Elves before they came out, and yet here they are, so who knows, we may get other surprises in the coming weeks and months. Speaking of which, of course, hopefully we'll be able to do some more Silmarillion over the course of the same time period, as well as more Reforged. There's also going to be the continuation of the Rise of Mordor stuff, which I fell off a little bit doing that over the course of the holiday period and then being sent away for work in January, but hopefully I can do the top 5 spear infantry in the near future. And then, of course, moving on later into the year where, as I've said a few times, potential upheaval is on the way, but hopefully in a positive light for the channel. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. But I'll, of course, have a channel update video ready for when relevant news becomes known to me. So yeah, big thank you to Lord of Belagos for pointing this one out for me. Big thank you to the players involved, especially to Tundra's Fox, who had the foresight to save this one. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.